Hi, so this is a part 2 of the tutorial I posted a while ago. I promised to make a follow-up video which goes more conceptually about basically how the web works, what Lovable is. Basically, you will understand what's happening behind the scenes, and that will help you with your development. Even though you're just prompting Lovable, it will still help you develop the app. To start, I want to answer one of the most important questions in my opinion. Okay, so basically, why should we even build an app to start? What is an app? So I'm going to answer these questions now. It's basically a way to structure information and to transform information. That was very abstract, but I'm going to go into detail what I mean by that. So an app or software or a website, basically app means application. It's just lines of code compiled, and lines of code is basically just algorithms and data structures. And basically with algorithms and data structures, you can do a lot of things. For instance, you can make Uber, the app Uber, where you connect drivers and people who want to be driven somewhere. You're basically organizing people through these data structures and algorithms, the algorithms which match different people and the data structures which store all of the data. And basically you can break this down into 4 components, in my opinion. You can break it down into the interface. Usually this is called the front end, so interface. And then you also have the database where you store data. You can also call this, storage, or maybe your state. Your state machine is a bit of a fancy word you can use, or your store. But basically we can just call it the database where you store your data. And that's like the most common name. There are different types of databases, and those are usually, sub-categorized into these different, like you have your storage where you store images and files. Then you might have like a state where you store temporary data. And then you have some other things. I would say you also have your algorithms, which are basically, they don't have any state. These perform actions. You can also think of them as functions. Maybe in terms of Uber, they would filter, maybe they would sort, maybe they would have more advanced AI algorithms which figure stuff out. And then I would also say you have your connections to external services. So you have your connections right here. And all of these are different components which apps consist of. And putting all of these things together, you can get a lot of functionality. For instance, if we take a look at some of the top companies right now, there's a reason why we're called the information age. We go on some websites, we can see here that basically a lot of the top companies are just software companies. Nvidia, yes, they make hardware. However, they also have their CUDA platform, software platform basically, which accounts for a lot of their revenue, their moat. We also have Apple that makes hardware, but they also have their iOS, their Mac system basically. You have Google, which is completely a software company. You have Microsoft, which is also basically a software company. Yes, they sell computers, but it's actually their OS, their Windows software that they're selling, and their Microsoft Excel and their Word, which accounts for their revenue, I believe. And then we also have Amazon, which is of course a software company. And then we have some other companies, Oil, and these are actually hardware. And then we have Meta, another software company, and some other stuff. But however, we're in the information age because it turns out that combining all of these structures and things can bring a lot of value into society. And not only can it bring a lot of value, it can also capture a lot of that value and build some pretty big companies. So basically, you would want to build an app because this system of transforming data and saving data is very useful in this world, organized humans. But why would you want to build an app? I feel like maybe we dodged the question here, but the reason why you want to build an app is because maybe you want to solve a problem using an app. So maybe you want to solve a problem. Maybe it's a problem that you have, so you have this problem. Maybe it's a problem that your friend has. Maybe it's a problem which you think you can commercialize and make money out of by solving. So you have the SaaS model. You're providing software as a service, and maybe you're charging monthly for that. Let's say you're charging $20 a month, and you do that to 200 customers, then you're making $4,000 a month. And of course you might have some costs, but the thing with software is that the costs are usually very low because you can scale it in a very good way. Basically. So if you're trying to commercialize, maybe you're also trying to raise a lot of money because so many software companies make it, or actually let me rephrase that. There is a possibility when you build a software company that it can become very big because it's so scalable. So then you have venture capitalists who are willing, if you have the right kind of credentials, to maybe invest in your company to, basically own a portion of that. And if your company becomes a big success, they and you will make a lot of money. So maybe you're a founder, VC-backed founder who wants to build software, or maybe you're just building something yourself and you're just trying to make some money at the side. And usually then you can like bootstrap, which means not raising any capital. And now with these AI tools like Lovable, you don't have to hire programmers. So this is a very viable option where you just build it yourself. And usually you get into the category of indie hackers who basically just build stuff on their own in their bedrooms. And there are some big names in this space who made a lot of money just building their own software products. And of course, if you're solving your own problem, then you don't even have to think about the commercial parts, and you're providing value to yourself. And now with AI tools, yet again, this is becoming much more of a common thing, or a much more of a possibility, I guess. Build something quickly that solves your own problem. Okay, so that is why you could build an app. And we have kind of talked about what an app is now. It's this kind of system of components that lives in your phone and also lives in a database somewhere interacting with each other. It's a piece of code, basically. Now, let's say, you've thought about these things now. I want to solve a problem. Maybe I want to learn Spanish. Okay, this is a problem of mine, and I hate the Spanish learning apps out there. I think they're too complicated. I don't like how they do things. I want control. I want to solve my own problem of learning Spanish. And perhaps other people, want to use my app eventually. But for now, this is going to be good. Also, some notes on this. Apps are basically all of this, but they come in different forms, right? Like you can have a web app or a web app, or you can have a website, or you can have a mobile app, or you can have, a Windows app that you download on your computer. / you can have an iOS app that you download on your Mac computer. So you can have all sorts of software comes in different forms, basically. And usually this would be written in different programming languages. But when we talk about Lovable, we only build web apps and websites. There are some ways to convert your website into a mobile app using tools like Capacitor is one of them. But for now, let's just talk about web apps. And basically the difference between web apps and websites are that web apps usually have more functionality. They usually have like a database where you can save user data. They enable you to do more things, while a website is usually just informative. It's plain, HTML is the language on the web called. It's just text, basically. But a web app is more advanced. You interact with it. And basically, like an app is just shorthand for application, so it covers all of these things. But usually nowadays, when we say an app, we're actually referring to a mobile app usually. But I'm just going to say app for or web app or the website. All right, so now we have basically covered, what an app is, what a website is, and how this all connects. Let's say we have figured out my idea. So let's say I wanted to learn Spanish, and I wanted to build my own flashcard Spanish learning app. Spanish learning app. And let's say I also wanted it to be AI enhanced. I wanted it to have text to speech, so I can hear the vocalization of the Spanish. And let's also say that I wanted to be able to use it on different devices. I want to be able to sign up and save information. And basically what I'm doing here is that I'm listing out the features, right? And the more detailed we can be here, the better, because then we'll have a better understanding of what we need for our app. But let's just start off with this. Now, I think the second step, once we have our idea for our app, is figure out, is this idea even good? Is this even a good idea? Like maybe there are already Spanish learning apps out there I could use instead. Maybe I should stop learning Spanish. Maybe I should learn some other language. I don't know. I think this is an important step though, like realize why we're building this. And then another step, I would say, is it even possible to build this app? Like, can we even build this app to begin with? Obviously, a Spanish flashcard app is possible because there are apps which are like that exists. Is the AI functionality possible? Yes, now with the modern AI LLMs like in ChatGPT and Claude, it is possible to have it be AI enhanced, whatever this entails. Of course, we probably want to add more details on what this actually means. Sometimes you might want to build something which is not possible to build. Like, let's say I wanted an app which, basically lets you spawn a dinosaur outside of your house at 2 a.m. every morning. Like, that wouldn't be possible. Then we're basically trying to create something physical, a dinosaur which doesn't exist. An app can't do everything. So there are limitations here. However, this is possible. The more this video goes on, the more you will understand kind of what type of things are possible to build when it comes to software, because we'll get a deeper understanding of what software actually is and what Lovable is capable of, and what, what apps are basically. So this will become clearer as time goes on. Is it even possible to build this app? But yes, this app is possible. We know that these technologies exist. We know that they are open to be integrated with. There are text-to-speech services that we can use. There are AI services which we can use. We can save information in the database. This app is possible. Of course, if we stretch this too much, like let's say we wanted the AI to tell us when we're about to forget a word in our heads while we're going on a walk without internet in the middle of like a wasteland, then of course it can't do that. It can't read our minds. We'll have to have some sort of interface which we interact with, that the AI can base its decisions on. It can't just magically remind us like it can remind us on a timer, of course, but like basically there are physical limits to these things, but this is definitely possible. Okay, so basically we know that the app is possible. We know what type of technologies we can use to make this app work. Another question could be who's going to use the app. In my case, I'm going to use the app. Maybe my friend is going to use the app. In some other cases, maybe businesses are going to use the app. That's also good to think about who is the user and the customer. Now, once we know these things, it's also probably good to plan out our app more thoroughly. Like how should the app actually function? We probably want to add more details on the AI enhanced functionality. Like maybe we want to make it such that if we get a flashcard, we can ask questions about that flashcard. So ask questions about flashcard, or like about also a flashcard used for those who don't know. Like a flashcard is basically like one of these cards you can put words on and you can practice the words. And in our case, it would be like digital flashcards, like Quizlets. Maybe you can ask questions about it. You can ask an AI, ask AI tutor about your flashcards. Maybe you have some sort of algorithm which decides when certain flashcards should show up based on how good you are at selecting the right answer. You could have something like that. And you plan this out thoroughly. You can do it in a Google Doc. You can even ask an AI to help you plan. You can ask Lovable inside of plan mode to try to ball these ideas with. And then basically you can write up your entire product description. This is called a PRD, product requirements document. And basically you can have this document now that describes the entire product, and you can just provide this document to Lovable, and Lovable will begin building this. And we should probably just keep this document in store in the, so we can always refer back to it as our source of truth. Now, the question becomes, how is Lovable even going to build this app? Like, how is Lovable going to make this into reality? Well, that's what I want to talk about right now. I want to talk about how Lovable works and how Lovable creates these different components and it compiles it all into a web app and makes the entire thing work. So what is Lovable? This is the question. So Lovable is basically, the Lovable AI. And then I would also say Lovable is the Lovable environment. Okay, so we have the Lovable AI. Another way to put this is the Lovable tech stack / tool stack. And basically, when you're creating software, you would pick a tech stack. You would pick a list of tools which you're going to use to create the software. And maybe you're picking this tech stack based on the product you want to create. Maybe you have a favorite tech stack that you always opt into. Right now, in the modern era, there exists a lot of tools that makes it so much easier for you to build software products. And Lovable is built on top of a lot of these tools. And basically, if you're a developer today writing code manually, you would probably always use some of these tools to write your product. You wouldn't write in binary, ones or zeros, and you probably wouldn't write in HTML and CSS. You would use frameworks and things on top of these layers to abstract it further to make it easier for yourself. And we have a very opinionated tech stack that every single Lovable project uses, that we know that our AI is really good at using. And the tech stack that Lovable uses is also kind of capable and broad enough to be able to create a big range of different types of software. Basically, you can create any type of software within this Lovable tech stack because it's so broad. I'm actually going to describe this right now. It's going to become a bit technical, but I think this context is useful for you to understand. You don't have to understand every single piece of it, but just having this overarching understanding will help you when you're building. Let me use the AI robot. Let me just find like an image here. So you have the Lovable AI, and then you have the Lovable tech stack. This is how a tech stack could look like. a tech stack could like something like this. This is not our tech stack though. This is just an example of how a tech stack could look like. But basically, the Lovable agent will write code, and code is just text, right? It will write all of this code, and then the Lovable environment will compile this code into these different components. It will compile it into the interface, the front end, the database, the connections. And then those things will basically be plugged into the stack and work together and be scaffolded together by the Lovable agent. So basically, it writes code, the code gets compiled or built into a working software product that you can interact with. How does the Lovable tech stack work? So basically, we have these components yet again. So this is why I chose to break it down in this way. So we have the interface, the front end is what I'm going to call it. So it's basically the thing that you interact with. And we're using a library or a framework, whatever you want to call it, an abstraction called React, which makes it easier for the Lovable agent to write the front end. And it's very popular. It's probably the most popular front end framework that a lot of developers use. Most developers, I would say, use React. And React makes it easier to write this front end, and your front end are your buttons. So it's like, maybe if you're doing a search panel, you have the search button. Maybe you have like a form element. You can have the submit button. You can have different views. If we're making our Spanish app, one element could be like the card itself. The background color, all of this is part of the front end, the styling, the things that you see on an app. And then you also have the database. On Lovable, we call our database a Lovable Cloud, basically. So you have the Lovable Cloud right here, which has the database, but you also have a couple of other things. So you have the database within Lovable Cloud, but you also have something called edge functions. These are also called endpoints. So basically, an edge function is just a certain type of endpoint. And these are basically algorithms or functions that are ran on the backend. You can also run functions on the front end, like the sorting, the filtering functions. Maybe you're pressing on one button and something's happening on a different page. Of course, the front end could have multiple pages. So maybe you have if you're making this flashcard app, maybe you have a landing page, and maybe you also have like a flashcard deck page. Maybe you have a dashboard page, and maybe you have some sort of algorithm which makes it such that when you press a button here, something happens there. Maybe the dashboard updates. These would be algorithms on the front end, but you can also have algorithms on the back end or functions on the back end doing different things. And the reason why you would want to have a function on the back end is there are a plethora of reasons for why you want to have a function on the back end. One of the reasons is because your function is secret. Maybe you have secret information within your function which you don't want to expose to your users, because your users are interacting with the front end. Your users are literally downloading the entire front end when they're visiting a website, or at least they're downloading that page. So you don't want to have that, sensitive information. So another thing that you can have in the back end are computationally expensive actions. So like maybe you're running an algorithm which requires a lot of compute. Then you probably don't want to run that on the user's device. Then maybe you want to make an update. You want to update database, and maybe you want to update the database in such a way where you don't want the user to be able to do this directly. Instead, you have an edge function, an algorithm, which takes the user's requests. So you press on a button, maybe here, boom, you press on a button, and this makes a request to the edge function, and then that updates the database. So your edge function is working like some sort of proxy to the database. So action requires elevated permissions. That was one way to put it. So these are basically the reasons for why you would want to use an edge function. Store secrets, it's computationally expensive, or it requires elevated permission. Then you also have a couple of other things. So you have your database where your database looks kind of like a set of spreadsheets with tables and rows where you store user information. Usually you have some sort of mapping between different tables. So maybe you have one table with user information, maybe one table with, in our case, flashcards, and they were mapped together for user IDs, flashcard IDs, and that's how they map together. You would probably also have some sort of authentication service. And the Lovable, of course, provides that by default. So authentication is basically just sign in and sign up. So you want a way for users to sign in such that you can map that user to fields in the database where you can store data. So when you go on your web app, you can log in, and then you can have access to all your data. So what happens when you log in then is that you say, I am this user, and this user should have access to this data. Hence, I'm going to log in, prove that I'm that user, and then that data will be sent to the front end, and it will be displayed. So basically, this is how it works. This is where you authenticate, and then you can store data across sessions and across devices. A point on this is that you don't want other users to be able to access other users' data. You want the user to be able to access his own or her own data, usually, typically. And that's why we have something called, in our case, row level security rules, or also RLS policies. And these policies basically describe how you're able to interact with the database. Users can only access their own info. Users can only update their own info. Users cannot do this, blah, blah, blah. And Lovable writes these themselves. And the Lovable agent, as with all of these other things, also writes these row-level security rules. And that is also why we have the scan your app feature, security scan. And it basically goes through your row-level security rules and makes sure that they actually are comprehensive and basically make your app safe, that they don't miss anything. And it also goes through a bunch of other security stuff, but this is like the most important thing and like the most basic security feature any type of app should have. So it basically hinders people from editing the database and changing things if they don't have the right permissions. So I'm gonna actually take this and I'm gonna put this here as a note over here. And the authentication, you can also enable different types of authentication. So you can do like password and email, you can do Google, you can do Apple authentication, etc. Then we also have in the database, as I mentioned, we have these tables and rows. You can also have other sorts of data like images and videos. And those are also kind of stored in the database, but we usually call these like storage buckets instead. And these are kind of different types of databases made to store these other types of files. So you have like storage buckets. And they work basically exactly in the same way, where you would, write security rules to access these storage buckets, so only certain users have access to certain items within these buckets. So we have our edge functions, our authentication, our database. Another thing which we can have in our backend used for basically making our lives easier is some sort of secrets store. So for instance, when we are calling upon an external service, so if we go back to our app here, our Spanish-speaking Spanish app, we want to make it AI enhanced. And we probably want to call some API. So let's say we wanted to call the OpenAI API, and an API is basically an interface, a way to use an external service. So OpenAI has an API where you can use their AI models. So you can use their GPT-5 model, for instance. So you can call upon the GPT-5 API to use that within your app. However, you don't want to do this directly to the front end, because you need to identify yourself as a customer to OpenAI, because they're going to charge you for using their service. And in those cases, you have something called an API key to identify you as a customer. And you don't want to expose that to your front end, because then other people can take your API key and use it themselves. And you will be charged from OpenAI, because OpenAI thinks you're using their service, when in actuality someone else has just taken your API key. So that is why when you use Lovable, you have this little pop-up appear where you input your API keys safely, and those are actually stored in one of these secret stores. And then those API keys, OpenAI API key, those are then injected into one of these edge functions, or functions that are ran on the back end, that will then call upon the OpenAI service, rather than just having your API key right here in your front end and have that call upon the OpenAI service, which wouldn't be safe. So you have this kind of edge function, or this backend, working as a proxy, and a proxy is basically just the middleman, which makes sure that your secrets are safe. So instead, a user would do something in the interface here on the front end, call upon an edge function, which then calls upon the OpenAI API or OpenAI service, which then returns with, in our case, if it's an AI, it returns with the generation of tokens. So it returns with the AI responding, and then that response can then be forwarded to the front end again. So the edge function is working as a middleman to make sure that our API key is safe. So basically, this allows us to have more control. We can rate limit users. We can check if a user is a paid customer before we accept the request to GPT-5, and in that way, it's basically more safe. Of course, the user is still indirectly basically using our API key, because it's calling upon the service using the key, but at least the user does not have access to the key, and we can check that the user is paying for our service, and we can basically control these things. So this is the way to do it. Now, some services are actually kind of public, and those you might not have a secret key to. Let me think if I can find an example of this, but I think the Google Maps API actually doesn't have a secret key. So in those cases, you can just call upon it directly in the front end. However, then on the Google Maps UI, when you're setting this up to use their service, their API, you would basically make sure that the IP address is coming from your website. So there are ways that which this is handled. Usually these API services are private, and then you would have a private API key. But in some cases, you can have them interact directly with a public API key. Basically, this gives us the rundown on how your Lovable app works. So when you're prompting Lovable, Lovable is writing all of this code, sometimes front-end code, sometimes back-end code, and sometimes it's writing these updates to the database. Sometimes it's creating a new edge function to talk to some new service. Sometimes it's asking you to provide an API key to save in the secret store to then inject in the edge function, etc., etc., etc. And I hope everything is starting to click now, right? Because we have our service right now. We have our app right here. And we can notice that a lot of these things are just external services, like text-to-speech. I'm pretty sure Google has a text-to-speech service. So you would probably just call this text-to-speech service and be like, oh, I want to use this text-to-speech service. Well, then we need the text-to-speech Google API key, and we store that. And we need a new edge function to call that. And Lovable basically creates this for us. And we can also understand which things aren't possible. Like, let's say we wanted to interact with some closed software. I mean, let's say LinkedIn. I'm pretty sure LinkedIn has a pretty limited API, and we wanted to somehow get everyone's data on LinkedIn. That's probably pretty hard if they don't have an API. So you could search up LinkedIn, LinkedIn API capabilities, and you can try to get an understanding of what the LinkedIn API can do. It seems like they do have an API here, but maybe it's quite limited. You can verify marketing tools, you can advertise, but can you scrape? Probably not. But you can talk with Lovable about these things to understand what's actually possible. So you can take a look at these APIs. You can also search up cool APIs on the internet, right? And you can see, okay, what are a list of public APIs? Okay, interesting. You can see what these ones do, and you can get inspiration. And as I said, APIs are just a way for a service to expose itself on the web, and usually it costs. But usually the cost is very low. Some APIs are free. Usually they might have a free tier, which you can use. If you charge for your service, then you're going to be able to use the API as well, right? So if you charge $12 a month and each user is just using an API which costs for that particular user maybe $1 a month, then you have like $11 profit each month, right? So this is kind of unit economics that you have to make. But usually APIs are not that expensive. This is how the web works. Now, another thing now to remember is that, okay, we want to build our app. What's the best way to ensure that we succeed with our app? I don't think it is writing the correct prompts, right? I think this is a misconception. I don't think it matters that much how you prompt the AI. Of course, you want to make sure that you're giving enough context and that you're providing enough details on what you want to build. But usually the failure prompt is not that you prompted the AI incorrectly, or that you misspelled the word, for instance, or that you phrased this in a bad way. Usually it has to do with a misunderstanding of how the app should function. You don't understand exactly the flows and the functionality that you want and how you're going to realize that functionality. That's usually the issue, not with how you phrase your prompts. Of course, it's all going to boil down to the prompts at the end of the day, but the gap is not the prompts. The gap is the understanding of which services you have to use to realize your app. Now, Lovable will automatically select services, which makes sense. If you tell Lovable, I want text-to-speech, Lovable is probably going to find the text-to-speech API and do a bunch of things for you, right? And that's the goal for us as a company, for Lovable to just do most things for you. There might be instances where Lovable is going to ask you a question back and be like, okay, this might be possible, but you have to interact with this service. You might have to sign up to this service, create an account, and get an API key and put that in. And then it's really important to listen to Lovable and see what Lovable is responding to you. Right? The Lovable AI might say in the chat, we can do this, but you need to do this first and sign up here. Or the Lovable AI could just be like, this is probably not possible. It's going to be very hard to do. If you say something really difficult, like get every single user from LinkedIn and put them in a list and sort the list with the person with the most followers, like maybe that's not possible because you can't actually access that data, right? That's usually the problem in a lot of apps where you cannot access the right data. Maybe you want to make an app which tells you how many dog owners are out walking with their dogs on a Tuesday in Sweden. Like maybe that information is, you can't actually get that data live. So that's one of the limitations you have to think about when building your app. Like, can I actually get this data? And those things you can chat with Lovable about. Now, one way that makes all of this way easier is that we have something called the connectors, or like native integrations. And basically what connectors allows you to do is integrate with these external services without having to deal with any of the API keys, basically. You don't have to provide the API keys. You don't have to sign up to these services. You don't have to think about it. Because Lovable, we basically wrap these services and we handle this for you, basically, in Lovable. So if you go on the Lovable website, you might have to sign in actually. And then if you go on settings, and then if you go on connectors, we have these two categories. We have the shared connectors and the personal connectors. Now the shared connectors right here are a list of services, external services you can basically add to your Lovable app without much setup. So let's say I wanted my app to have AI, my flashcard app. Then I can just tell Lovable to add AI, and I press that allow button, and then my app will have AI without me having to figure out which AI provider I should go with, getting an API key and signing up and making the integration. So this works with AI, it works with Firecall, a scraper, works with Shopify, Slack. You can have an AI that interacts with your Slack workspace, works with Stripe and payments and the cloud, which is the whole backend. But then you also have personal connectors. And personal connectors are different. They are not connectors which you add to your app. They're rather connectors which the Lovable agent itself has access to. So if we go back to our explanation here, we have the Lovable agent, and then we have the environment that basically creates the app. Shared connectors would be things that you add to your app. It would be these connections, while personal connectors would be connectors that the Lovable agent has access to. If you add like the personal connector Notion, or if you add Granola, you would basically be able to ask the Lovable agent, oh, can you fetch some information about my to-dos on Notion? And then the Lovable agent will basically ask Notion and be like, Notion, can you send me over some information about Isaac's to-dos? And it will have this context. Now, it can do whatever with this context. It can just reply to you and say, these are your to-dos. Or you can ask it, use my to-dos, and then update the app and add the to-dos in the app. There you go. Or Granola is the note taker that takes notes on your meetings. So you can be like, Lovable agent, we just had a meeting about how we can improve the Lovable app. Can you implement the things we talked about during the meeting? And then it will go ahead and write the code and update the app. So these are basically something called build time, which is the time when you're chatting with the AI. And then the shared connectors would be runtime, which is the time when someone is using the app you have built. So basically shared connectors work inside of the app that you have built. You're adding some functionality to the app, while build time connectors, personal connectors, are just things that the Lovable AI agent can gather information or talk to. You can also make updates to Notion through the Lovable agent if you have that connection. As you can see, you also have, for example, Amplitude, which is like basically a data analytics tool. So if you have connected Amplitude to your app, you can then use this personal connector to connect that to your Amplitude account and ask Lovable about your app data, because Lovable has access to this Amplitude thing. So basically, you give the Lovable agent more abilities to interact with your data and with your services that you use. And it's not only a one-way fetching information from your services. The Lovable agent can also do it the other way around and update your Notion. So you can have both a personal Notion connector, like a personal connector, and you can also have a Notion integration within your app itself. So you can have Notion as a thing integrated to one of your Lovable apps. And a note on this is that if you integrate Notion to a Lovable app, that's an integration which happens between the app and Notion. But if you integrate Notion with your Lovable agent, your personal connector, then that will be available basically anywhere where you chat with Lovable. So in any app, it will have this connection. So these personal connectors are connected to your personal Lovable account. So they work across projects. And basically you can read up on this here. If you go and read more, you can also ask Lovable about this, while this would be project by project. And we're continuously adding more of these connectors. It's actually one of our biggest priorities at Lovable to add more connectors so it's easier to connect to more services. Now, I also want to note that don't let the absence of a connector stop you from connecting to an external resource. As I said, you can basically connect your Lovable app to any external API out there. It's just that if there is a connector, it's easier to do it, but you can still do it pretty easily. You just have to provide the API key. This makes sense. And just for some context, if you search up API, like what's the API actually means? It means application programming interface. It's a set of rules and protocols allowing different software applications to communicate, exchange data, and share functionality. So basically, the APIs, as it outlines, it's just the structure that is used to then communicate to different services. So you would have an API here, you would have an API here that communicates to each other. So your app would basically have its own API that it uses to communicate with other apps' APIs. Now that we have this understanding of what a lovable app is, I want to talk about some common mistakes that people usually do. So I've used proprietary lists because I don't want to freestyle this part that hard. Follow this list. So the first one is not understanding user roles. So when you're creating an app, sometimes you have different user roles. So maybe you have users of the app, but maybe you also have admins. And these, it's very good to outline this to Lovable upfront. Like I would say all of these structural things, all of these core features, all of these building blocks are things which you should outline in the beginning of your building process, so it makes it easier for Lovable to build your app. And having defined your user roles in the beginning of the building process is a very important thing and helps you a ton, because then Lovable can basically use that as the scaffolding, and then you can build on top of that. So I would say make sure that you're defining your user roles. Maybe you just have one user. Actually, in the Spanish learning app, you would just have a user, right? You wouldn't have an admin. But maybe you can, share a project. Then you might want to have like an admin role who have certain privileges, and then a user role or whatever. Or maybe you're making like a team dashboard, or maybe you're making like a blog article site. Then you probably want an admin who can edit and create articles, and then you have readers, etc., etc. So these are things which you should think about upfront. And then also not understanding if data is dynamic or not. So sometimes when you're building your app in Lovable, maybe Lovable will create some mock data just to display how the interface could look like if there were real data. But we of course should be careful about that, because we always want to make sure that the structure is in place before we start building a bunch of stuff on top of each other. So I would always make sure that you're aware if the data you're seeing on display is actually dynamic data or just mock data. When you have enabled Lovable Cloud, usually Lovable will not just add a bunch of data to your app. So that could be one like quick signal to see if there's no data in your app, and if you've just created your flashcard app and no flashcards are visible, then it's probably because Lovable has enabled Lovable Cloud and not added any flashcards yet. But if you create your app and there already is a bunch of data, then maybe Lovable has just created some mock data for you to view how it would look like. So always make sure, is this dynamic data or not? Have we actually hooked this up to the backend? But as soon as you have enabled Lovable Cloud, Lovable will basically make sure that when you add a new feature, it's hooked up to the backend, and data is not mock data, it's actually dynamically stored in the backend. But it's still good to know. And then another one is not giving enough context to the agent. So really breaking down what do you want to happen. If you just give a vague request, like make it AI enhanced, then Lovable will make it AI enhanced, but it might not make it AI enhanced in such a way that you would like. Like maybe you have a very specific idea of how the AI functionality should look like within the app. And in those cases, you should make sure to give the agent context on that. Same thing when debugging. If something is not working, make sure that you provide enough context to why it's not working. And then we also have not knowing what you want. This is kind of connected to this. You want to make sure that the feature that you want to add, you have a good grasp on what it should actually do. And not reading what Lovable tells you. I talked about this earlier, but you want to make sure that you actually read what Lovable is saying. Of course, in the beginning, maybe you can just prompt away and not really care about what the Lovable agent is saying. But especially if you get stuck, like maybe the Lovable agent is telling you something important, which you need to know. So I would actually always suggest reading what Lovable is saying to you quickly. Yeah, so those were like some of the mistakes, or some of, not necessarily mistakes, but some things you should think about not doing when building with Lovable. So try to make sure, of course, we all do these things, especially I tend to forget to just read what Lovable is telling me. And sometimes that leads me to maybe making a couple of prompts which I could have avoided if I just read what Lovable was saying. Then I also have this list of more tips, things to avoid. Then we have like general tips, so using screenshots to provide context. Of course, now Lovable actually has an ability to test the app itself and take screenshots and kind of debug itself with the recent agent update. So this is actually less relevant, but I would still make sure to use screenshots because it still helps out. I mean, maybe there are some parts you want to emphasize, like this thing right here is not working, and maybe you don't have time to write it out, like, oh, the thing to the left of the sign up page. Instead, you can just take a screenshot and maybe still write a bit of text, but the screenshots help a lot. And you can use plan mode if you want to, don't want Lovable to start writing immediately. Maybe you want to, talk with Lovable about potentially adding a feature. And maybe when you're debugging, you can use plan mode. You can also join the Discord server if you ever get stuck and you want to talk with a real person. There are usually people almost all the time in the Discord server that you can talk to. And then I also talked about these RLS security rules. I just added it here before. This was more important to think about, but now with the security scan, you basically can make sure that you can basically run the security scan, and Lovable will read through your security rules and make sure that they are good. And there are also some other security stuff that Lovable will be doing, like making sure that all your endpoints make sense and that data is handled correctly. And then we also have hosting and publishing. So when you're hosting and publishing your app, typically you would have to go to a hosting provider. You would have to buy your domain using some external thing and then hook it up. Basically with Lovable, this is simplified, where you have the one-click publish and then you can buy domains within Lovable. So I just wanted to shout that out basically on how these things work. Basically, your backend would be hosted on a server and your frontend would also be hosted on the server, but your backend would not be served to the user. Rather, it's the frontend that is being served to the user, and the backend is just basically sitting in the server, running and accepting requests as they come. I think this gave us a pretty comprehensive overview of how the web works and how Lovable works. And I think now when you're building your apps, you'll be able to look at the Lovable chat and you'll be like, oh, I actually know what's going on here. I know what's happening. It makes sense. This makes sense. Oh, maybe we can use this API instead. Oh, I see why Lovable is suggesting this. Like, you will actually have an understanding of what's going on. So I think this is a valuable piece, and you can always watch this video again and skip to different parts if there's something you want to catch up on. You can always ask Lovable questions about these things. But the good thing is that you really don't have to know any of this to build an app with Lovable. This is just like the tipping of the cake. Like you can know these things and you can try to just get a basic understanding of these things to aid you in the development, or maybe you're just interested in these things, but you don't really have to know these things, and you definitely don't have to go in depth on what these things are. However, with this understanding, you will be able to just generally be more effective. Thank you guys so much for watching this video. I might make a part 3 where I go into different areas of building, but I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye bye.